Another thing that's very different between then and now, because we are talking the early 18th century here, is that the parties, you have sort of vague party lines that are drawn. Someone's sort of ideologically a Tory or ideologically a Whig, but whoever would be the head of government, again, we have a Prime Minister, or First Lord of the Treasury, technically, who's very definitely legally the head of government. So even here now, or at least before Walpole's time, you didn't have that. You just had a number of ministers. Some might be more preeminent than others. Some might be able to just wield more gravitas than others.
Yeah.
But you didn't necessarily have just one head of government. And so what that means is that the king, or the monarch, it might be a queen, it might be Queen Anne or Queen Mary or something, are still absolutely vitally important to the whole equation.
Yeah, because they're the ultimate decision makers, right? And so the job of the ministers is really to persuade the monarch to make the decision, rather than having the legal authority to make the decision on their own, right?
A king can and did sort of just request new ministers, and things. As I say, obviously, in quite a long time before this, nearly 100 years, a little less than 100 years before this, you've got the Oliver Cromwell days and the Revolution, or the Civil War, where Parliament really takes a step upwards in terms of its power versus the King's power. However, the sovereign can still just say, I don't like that particular minister. I want another one.
Yeah.
Bring me another. And so you still need the sort of good graces of the king.
The king is still is the most important political actor in the play, whereas now no one even thinks about the king, and everyone's got the impression that if Parliament wanted, they could just do away with the king, which I find interesting. I'd like to see them try, to be honest.
Yeah.
I'd like to see how the British public prefers the monarchy to the Parliament.
So it's very different. I say all that because just to point out that it's very different to what we have today.
Yeah,
where the head of government is the Prime Minister, but the head of state is still the king.
Yeah. There's an interesting interplay of how traditions become formalised here, right? Because we're looking at the beginning, the genesis of where we are now, right? So we take all of this for granted, but actually it was, it wasn't, handed down, intact by some political god or something like that. This slowly but surely was a series of negotiated compromises and sort of best in the circumstances decision making for 300 years.
And where we don't have sort of formal political parties that might have like a whip system.
Yeah.
So it's all very, someone might sort of politically backstab you at the drop of a hat.
Yeah.
Or there's lots of bribery. There's lots of corruption going on. Lots of corruption. Because a lot of it is just to do with if you give people favours and grease their palms, or give them, if you've got the power to distribute favours, then it's like sort of bribery. That's just the best way of putting it.
To be honest with you, we can see that now. I mean, look at who Boris Johnson elevated to the honours system. Like his hairdresser.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, civil lists.
Yeah.
The civil list, when you give someone some sort of honour.
Yeah.
Or but back then it was all of that as well, but also just money.
Yeah.
You can't get away with that as easily now, although...
I'm sure it still happens.
Yeah, there's other ways there's more than one way to skin a cat.
I'm sure it's just one step removed. My company will pay your company for a service that you don't really have to deliver. Yeah.
Or when you're out of office, we'll put you on the board as an honorary thing, and you don't have to do anything, but you'll get loads of money. In the meantime, do what we want.
Yeah, we'll put you in charge of Facebook, Mr. Clegg.
Right, exactly that.
Yeah.
Exactly that, yeah. If you make sure this piece of legislation passes, when you're out of office, we'll then put you on the board of this oil company and you'll make loads of money.
Yeah.
And you've just got to wait a bit for it.
Yeah, and so this kind of patronage system still persists.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Okay, so Walpole, where he rules, should we say, for 20 years, more or less, 21 years, Even by the time he sort of starts that period, he'd already been on the scene for quite a while. He'd already been in Parliament and a player in Parliament for years and years before that. He was sort of still around during the Marlborough years.
Right. So what's his sort of early life then?
Yeah, so he's not. He's just a squire.
Right.
Yeah, they make him even before this period, I believe. But at some point, he's made a Knight of the Garter, which is extremely prestigious. It only entitles you to be Sir. At the end of his career, they do ennoble him to make him a lord, the Earl of Orford, at the end of his career. But anyway, they make him a knight, but a Knight of the Garter, which is the highest possible thing. And he's one of the few people ever to have achieved that and not be noble, not be extremely close to the throne or... so yeah, that sort of speaks volumes to his sort of talents or how close to the inner sanctums of power he was. They made him a Knight of the Garter, just as a, just as a squire. So in other words, not born to...
well, it's just a commoner.
Not blue-blooded, essentially a commoner, yeah.
So it's interesting, again, like Thomas Becket, we have an example of a very capable man who just happened to be the guy. And despite the fact that, of course, you've got the venerable aristocratic traditions around, they're like, yeah, but we do need him.
There are examples of exceptions to the rule.
Yeah.
If some people out there, some Americans, think that it was always, throughout all the centuries, it was just impossible to reach the upper echelons of the English or British institutions and society without being born to it. Well, it's not true. There are examples. From Becket to Walpole.
Yeah.
He wasn't just completely a peasant.
No.
But he wasn't born to land or anything like that. So, for example, in, 1712, 1713 sort of time, he is accused of corruption, venality. I mean, he'd been Chancellor of the Exchequer, or what today we would call the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He had been that during sort of the days of Marlborough and Godolphin. And, the charge against him was that he was, quote, guilty of a high breach of trust and notorious corruption. That was in 1710. And he was placed in the Tower of London. That's where you're put for like the worst possible crimes, and you're probably looking at a beheading.
Oh, yeah.
You're in a really, really tight spot if you're confined to the Tower.
Yeah.
But he was only there for 6 months, and in the end, sort of basically acquitted. It was a political stitch-up. His enemies sort of saw an opportunity to sort of level that against him, and it basically proved to be unfounded. It was some really small detail, something to do with some land holdings, some land contracts, I think, in Scotland. It wasn't like a giant thing, like he'd manipulated all of government.
Yeah.
It wasn't that. It was like a small, almost personal affair, and they tried to take him down for it, and very nearly did. But after about 6 months, the winds changed, and he was essentially acquitted. And during his time in the Tower, all the Whig notables, all the sort of leading lights of the Whig movement, would visit him, and sort of they made a political deal out of it. Yeah. Like, look how the Tories are unfairly imprisoning us. So he was made sort of like a political martyr on some level. And so when he got out, he was sort of, the Whig establishment made a point of rehabilitating his career. And he was not immediately, but straight away he was allowed to run as an MP again and win. But
just to add something here, like I recently read a book of 18th century executions, death penalty, the Bloody Code, that the Whigs instituted. And I should do a book club on it, actually, because it's really fascinating. But what for me is one of the most fascinating aspects is just how important these crimes of corruption were in the political system at the time. As in, if you were convicted of tampering with the currency or having done something especially corrupt, they would behead you for it. That you would literally be hanged. Sorry, beheaded, but you'd be hanged for such crimes. And so it's not funny to be accused of notorious corruption and put in the Tower of London, that is genuinely something that would get you killed. And so they had a kind of point saying, well, look, they are persecuting us over this minor thing. It's like, yeah, you're getting far too close to getting the rope.
So yeah, it shows that he's playing a dangerous game, or just that it is a dangerous game at the top of politics.
Oh yeah, very much more like Game of Thrones
in the 18th century. Yeah, they're sort of all playing for keeps.
Yeah,
and here or there, if they can, you'll get arraigned and put up on charges that have the death penalty.
Yeah, you're right. It's far too lax on our modern politicians. Far too few of them fear for their own lives.
Yeah, if it was up to me, Boris Johnson's crime of putting the whole nation under a type of house arrest for 2 years should really be deprived of his liberty.
And there are various others who I agree with.
Against the people, like the Blair people, people like Jack Straw.
Oh yeah, all of them. Everything they've done to this country. I mean, I would consider them capital crimes, but what do I know?
So you can see that there's a roller coaster going on where you go from being Chancellor of the Exchequer to imprisoned in the Tower to back to being right at the top of government. Yeah, that's truly sort of a political roller coaster. One of his closest political allies was Townsend, his brother-in-law, and at one point they're in power in about 1717, and with Townsend as sort of in charge of foreign policy essentially, and they have to resign, or they make, it's a political gambit to threaten to resign. Yeah. And if you're considered by the monarch or the power brokers, your power base, if you're considered too important, then that can work and you don't have to resign. But some other times your bluff is called. Yeah. And then you sort of are obliged to resign because you've said it now. Yeah. That happens. They threaten to resign over some foreign policy details. Because after 1714, we've got Anne dies and we've got George I, George I of Hanover. And just very quickly to say, is the Elector of Hanover, is a German. He doesn't speak English, like at all. When he came over, he literally almost didn't have a word of English. So anyway, it's just sort of very, very German. But one of the things that means is that the leading people in Parliament can sort of hoodwink him a bit. He's not completely aware of the extent of all his powers, and even in sort of the Privy Council or in his councils of state, he's literally not able to understand everything that's going on.
Articulate his own position, doesn't understand the political system. Yeah,
they have to talk through French if they can, or some broken Latin. I've got a quote right at the end from Winston Churchill. I've got loads of quotes from Winston Churchill on this one. It's only a small chapter in his book, but again, he's done very well. It's done very, very well. So, where Walpole had been in and around the cockpit of power for many, many years, it's not until the early 1720s that he starts the period of his career that historians look back upon and call it his premiership, if you like. And that all kicks off with the South Sea bubble. Right. Now, there's a whole Epochs that I did with Dan on the South Sea bubble. So if anyone's interested in that, look back through the list and you can watch that where we go into it in tons of detail. Don't actually talk particularly about Walpole. Towards the end of that episode, I mentioned Walpole, of course. So here, I'm just going to skate over it very quickly. But just to say, it's a financial crisis where a company is created, South Sea Company, to help essentially restructure our national debt. And it all goes awry. It's a giant bubble where shares in this company go up to an insane level and then crash. And lots of people lose money, lots of people, including Walpole and his friends. And apart from anything else, it's extremely embarrassing for the nation because the King and the Prince of Wales had backed it. Yeah. Everyone was duped by it, really. Sir Isaac Newton bought a bunch of stock. And an apparent genius didn't understand that he was looking at a bubble. I mean...
And the thing is, though, this is back in the day when the national prestige was important. It just doesn't feel like national you talking about like foreign policy. It's like, well, yeah, British foreign policy actually mattered in this era. It doesn't feel like it matters at all now. There's no national prestige. The politicians, the king, none of them feel like they should be proud of Britain. Whereas now, this was, yeah, exactly. This is a deep mishandling that speaks to the character of the nation in this. No one thinks like that now.
Yeah, it's a real shame.
Yeah, I know.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.